Okay, hi everyone. My name's Adam Smith and I'm a Cultural Engagement Fellow on an AHRC project, the title of which I've used for my talk today. It's called Sheffield, Print, Protest and Poetry. And this project, which is directed by Dr. Hamish Matheson, has been making use of two full sets of radical newspapers printed in Sheffield at the dawn of the 19th century. So there's two newspapers in this project. There's the Sheffield Register and there's the Sheffield Iris, and there's also two characters to keep a track of as well. There's Joseph Gales, the editor of the Sheffield Register, and there's James Montgomery, the editor of the Sheffield Iris. So the Register runs from 1787 to 1794, and then the Iris runs from 94 all the way through to 1825. And each was published weekly, and each was primarily a newspaper, and they behaved for the most part like you'd expect a newspaper to behave today. So the first page was dominated by national and international news, the second page was London news, page 3 was Sheffield news, and then page 4, which is my favourite page, is letters to the editor, letters from the editor, essays, and also something I'll be talking a bit more about today, Poetry Corner, which was on page 4. And this was a section where poems could be published that were written allegedly by Sheffield residents, although I think a lot of them were written directly by the newspaper's editorial team. But in theory, newspapers from Sheffield people. But first and foremost, these documents are newspapers, so they're profoundly engaged with what's happening around them. So just to quickly put them in context, these papers are coming out in Sheffield, where we are now, during a really fascinating period in British and European history. So behind me, there'll be some dates which I'm sure you're all very familiar with, and all of these events, they're bound up with questions of who should be in charge and what it means to be the subject to somebody else. So at the top there, of course, the Civil War, which is all about divine right and who should reign. And there's one of my favourite images there of Charles I being decapitated by an ancestor of Bolo from Goldfinger. So there's the Civil War. Then, of course, there's the American Revolution, which is all about the rights of American colonists and to what extent should they be dependent on decisions made by British government. Then you've got the French Revolution, which is all about French citizens rising up against absolute monarchy and the ancient regime. So a key theme that emerges during this period is a sense, on the winning teams at least, that no one should be dependent on the arbitrary will of another. Everyone has an entitlement to freedom, and later this would begin to play a larger role in the abolition movement, which is starting to get some traction at the end of my timeline. So Gales and Montgomery are writing just here. And although these were newspapers, they had very strong, very discernible interests and agendas. Indeed, the Register and the Iris are best unified by a central preoccupation with the question, what are the fundamental rights and entitlement of all people? And nowhere is this theme more distilled than in Poetry Corner. Of course, Gales and Montgomery didn't call it Poetry Corner. They didn't call it Poetry Corner. This is the name that was given by sort of recurring readers and affectionate readers. They called it the far more modest title, A Repository of Genius. And actually, when the Register becomes the Iris, they come up with a similar title, The Bower of Muses, as well. So they were quite into it. But a disproportionate amount of the poems printed in Poetry Corner are really, really angry. They're poems of protest. In fact, there are two anxieties expressed time and again all through these papers. The first is the question, how can a government located 200 miles south of Sheffield know what is best for Sheffield citizens? And the second one is a suspicion that the top government ministers were siphoning off taxpayers' money for their own private reserves, which begs the question, what chance will there ever be for progressive reform whilst politicians are looking out for their own self-interest instead of the nation's own interests? So as you can imagine, it was a strange and different time. And you can see this second anxiety emerging in the poem I've got behind you, which came out in April 1793. And I won't read this poem to you, but if you want to see it, you can visit our website where we've got a full digital anthology of this poem and other poems like it. But I just wanted to flag this one up because it's very typical of the poems you get in the Sheffield Register, in that it does something that most of these poems do, which is cheerfully embrace an opposing viewpoint, the view that the poem actually wants to criticise, and then endorse it in such exaggerated terms that it's actually rendered totally absurd. So this poem is sending up the idea that money is the answer to all problems, whilst highlighting that nothing will ever change for the better because everyone is far more interested in making their own fortune than they are the goods of the community at large. So it concludes brutally that all you really need to get on in this world is money. It says, to study or else is but nonsense, from hence all philosophy springs, 'tis the crown, beauty, cause and good conscience of priests, ladies, lawyers and kings. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, how times change. However, not everyone was enjoying what Gales was doing in the Sheffield Register, and in 1794 he was charged with conspiracy against the government for his work on the paper and for setting up something called the Sheffield Society for Constitutional Information, which was a society for Sheffield citizens to keep an eye on what the government was up to. Seeing no other choice, Joseph Gales ran away and fled to America, and without its editor, the Register came to an abrupt close. Fortunately, a few years earlier, Gales had hired a teenage jobbing apprentice boy, and this young man, who had actually ran away from Scotland upon discovering that his parents were going to become religious missionaries, had tried to make it down to London where he was going to forge a career for himself as a famous and successful poet. Unfortunately, he ran out of money in Rotherham and had to apply for this job at the Sheffield Register. He was hired as a jobbing apprentice boy, and he became a regular contributor to Poetry Corner, but he also became an enthusiastic acolyte of Gales's politics. And after Gales's abrupt exit, this young man actually raised the money to relaunch the paper himself as the Sheffield Iris. And as I'm sure you've guessed, this young boy was none other than James Montgomery, who would grow up to become the great champion of causes memorialised by the life-size bronze statue outside of Sheffield Cathedral, as well as by Montgomery Road, the one-time Montgomery Tavern, the Montgomery Theatre, and perhaps most impressively, this information board on the wall in the Wetherspoons on West Street. And when he died, Montgomery was remembered as a champion of causes, and he was mourned by a citywide, state-funded funeral. But in 1795, as he takes over the Iris, it's actually a very different story. And for printing the Iris, or for his work in protest and radicalism, he was actually dragged in front of a jury in Doncaster and charged with being a seditious, treasonous and villainous libeller. Interestingly, though, the poem he was prosecuted for publishing wasn't in the Iris, and he claimed he'd never seen it, and his defence actually proved that it had been printed 10 years previously. But he was still found guilty, which led him to write in a letter that I found in Sheffield Archives to one of his friends that no matter how good his defence was, the prosecution was levelled against the Iris. They were determined to crush it. And then he got out of jail, and he was back in there again 6 months later for reporting a story about the militia charging down a group of protesters. And in that case, no one disputed that had happened, but they said it was treasonous for him to report it because it cast the government in a bad light. And for this, it must have felt to Montgomery like history was repeating itself a little bit. It must have brought to his mind the final words of his former mentor, Joseph Gales' last ever editorial in the Register, which was actually printed the day after he ran away, which ended with these lines: "It is, in these persecuting days, a sufficient crime to have printed a newspaper which has so boldly dared to doubt the infallibility of our ministers." And actually, let me leave you now with a few more lines from that same editorial, which I think typify the project of Gales and Montgomery's papers. Gales argued that his intention was never just to rouse dissent for dissent's sake, but to print an impartial and truly independent newspaper. He explained, "I have done my endeavours, humble and limited as they have been, to rescue my countrymen from the darkness of ignorance and to awaken them to the senses of their privileges as human beings, and as such, of their importance in the grand scale of creation." Thanks very much, everyone. Thanks for listening.